Was Mrs. Travers, the creator of Mary Poppins, even more difficult than she was portrayed in Saving Mr. Banks? Should the protagonist of the film, Captain Phillips, who was captured by Somali pirates, have been faulted for possibly sailing his ship too close to the Somali coast? How legitimate were the scientific details in the fictional thriller Gravity? Many of this year's Oscar-contending films are being scrutinised for their accuracy. Film reporter John Horn joins me to talk about the truth, fiction and fact-checking in some of this year's potential award nominees. Hi John.
Hello Ann.
So John, when it comes to movies, is there a difference between being truthful and being factual, or aren't they the same?
I think they're a little bit different, and I think a good example would be 12 Years a Slave, which follows the narrative of Solomon Northup, who wrote about his experiences very closely. But in the beginning of the film, the filmmakers changed the sequence of some events. There's a little bit of compression of who did what to when, but the same story is truthful, and meaning what happened to Solomon is presented on screen, even if tiny factual changes have been made.
What other examples can you give us where accuracy is being questioned?
I think Saving Mr. Banks is a very good example. The real question around Saving Mr. Banks is whether or not Mrs. Travers, who is the author of the book that became Mary Poppins, was depicted in a more flattering light than she actually was. And I talked to two people who worked with the real Mrs. Travers, and they said she was far more difficult. She's depicted on screen, but the filmmakers felt if they showed her that way, that audiences would hate her, that she'd become a repellent character. So they toned her down, they cleaned her up, they made her a little bit more pleasant than in fact she was in real life.
Well, our director's feet being held to the fire. Who's doing the scrutinising here?
Well, there's two issues. I mean, one is if you present your movie as based on a true story or inspired by real events, if that's part of your marketing hook, you really have to deliver on the other half of that promise, which is you have to be based on a true story and you have to have real events. So yes, you have to have some sort of legitimacy to your story. And I think a lot of people, a lot of news organizations are examining these films. A lot of rival studios are saying, you know, why did Ben Affleck get to create an entire third act in Argo and still win the Best Picture Oscar? I think it's a legitimate conversation right now.
Well, movies are meant to provide kind of a form of escapism, and there should be, I suppose, a certain amount of literary license. Do moviegoers actually care if the truth is skewed a little bit?
I think they don't really, but I'll tell you an example I think is much more provocative, and that is The Wolf of Wall Street. Now, this is a biography based on an autobiography about Jordan Belfort, who is a Wall Street swindler. Now, the movie is very factual in that it represents everything that Jordan Belfort did in terms of how he fleeced customers. Critics of the film, including some of the people that he fleeced, said a complete story about Jordan Belfort has to include the victims. And the movie very aggressively doesn't deal with the victims and the people who lost their fortunes, lost their life savings. So there's a movie that is very factual, but its critics would argue is not truthful because it ignores the whole second half of the story, which is what happened to people he took advantage of.
Well, it's certainly fascinating. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Ann.
For more on this story and others, please visit latimes.com and follow us at LA Times on Twitter.